Thank you very much. Welcome to the session on the European Accessibility Act, and I want to thank you all so much for joining us, especially given it's the lunch hour. So I really appreciate that, and I hope that we can entertain you enough until food arrives. So I doubt there's anyone in this room that's sitting going, I've never heard of the European Accessibility Act. I'm sure there's many of you going, I've heard too much about the European Accessibility Act. But I'm glad that you're willing to sit and listen to a bit more of it today. I have a wonderful panel who are going to talk through various different aspects of the EAA and whether or not you're a large publisher, a small publisher, a vendor, anywhere in that supply chain, in that workflow, accessibility is probably something that you've been discussing more and more frequently as time progresses. And so, as most of us know, the European, I'll call the EAA, the European Accessibility Act, comes into force, and that's quite a scary word in itself, isn't it? When people, it comes into force, everyone, on the 28th of June next year. So that is when you need to be EAA ready with your accessible content and make sure that you're compliant. But as we all know, that's not an easy road. There are many bumps, there are many questions on that road. I think for all of us, anyone that's ever read the terms of that act and had those discussions, we all have questions. And hopefully we can help answer some of those today. And we're going to have a Q&A session at the end as well. So hopefully, get your questions ready and hopefully a wonderful panel will be able to answer them. But speaking of our wonderful panel, I'd love to introduce them to you now. So I'll start with Martin.
Yeah, my name's Martin Klopstock. I'm responsible for the publishing operations at a business publisher in London called Kogan Page. And that involves design, production, product metadata, and that's why accessibility is part of that role, because accessibility has a metadata angle and a product angle, and they are usefully combined in my team. And we started on the accessibility road, I would say, about 5.5 years ago. So we're reasonably towards the end of reaching that goal. And with that, I'll hand over to Vanessa.
I'm Vanessa de Bueger. I'm from Amsterdam University Press. I'm responsible for sales and marketing. I'm a sales marketing director, which is why accessibility has gone to me. I'm responsible for all the distribution and the wider readership of all our content, so accessibility is really important for us. We are in the middle of our journey, not there yet, so as a mid-sized university press, that might be an interesting perspective. Suresh?
Yeah, see, my name is Suresh Parandhaman. I'm from Integra Software Services. Integra is a pre-press vendor, and some of you are here today. We work with you already, and we help them in moving into accessibility. My role at Integra, focusing on the best workflows that we can have and also helping publisher to kind of set up their accessibility workflow. So that's my role. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. And I should mention, so my name is Stacy Scott, so I'm chairing the panel and I'm representing Taylor & Francis, but also the Publishing Accessibility Action Group. And so for those of you who don't know it, it's a group where everyone can come along, talk about accessible publishing, completely free. And there's various, we have a LinkedIn page, we have a mailing list, and we meet online every 2 months. So please do join us and talk to me about that at the end if you are not in the conversation and want to be. We'd love to have you. So I think, the aim of this, the description of this session is looking at, I think you will be hopefully comforted that nobody on the panel, including Taylor and Francis, nobody has said, we're at the end of that journey. We've completed it. Oh no, we're not worried at all. We've done it all, right? No, but I've not met anyone who's been able to say that. Some people are further ahead than others, and some people are at the beginning. And so we're going to cover a variety of different topics. A lot of it's going to be aimed at people that are thinking about the EAA, and they're at the beginning of the journey or they're in the middle. And the reason I want to stress that is because when it comes to questions, please don't shy away thinking, I don't want to say that we've not started yet. Because it doesn't matter when you start, as long as you start and you're part of that conversation. We're delighted that you're here, and all questions are welcome. It's an absolute safe space, and you'll always find that with the accessible publishing community and accessibility in general. It's not competitive. It's a shared experience. It's a shared goal to make all the content and access accessible and inclusive. So please feel free, please come to this session with that in mind. So, when we talk about accessibility, I think it's just key to, frame that. What do we mean by accessibility? Because wonderfully, we've heard it mentioned a lot in the past few days in these sessions. It's been mentioned in terms of barriers in terms of cost. But when we talk about accessibility today, we're talking about digital accessibility. So we're talking mostly about people who face barriers in accessing content due to having what we call a print disability. So that can be a visual impairment, so someone who uses magnification, or like me, someone who uses text-to-speech, which, just so you know, this is what I'm doing now. So I'm not actually sitting here on my socials whilst I'm talking to you in the panel chatting. I'm paying full attention. This is I've got text-to-speech and I have an AirPod in, so I can hear it if I need to. So that's just one of many options. But it's also for people who have different needs. So people who have dyslexia or ADHD, or people who have physical limitations in being able to hold or turn the pages of a printed book. So digital accessibility incorporates a lot of different people. And so we're going to cover a lot of the features that will support those people in this session today. So we've talked about accessible, what accessibility means. So what do we mean in terms of our books and our content? So when we talk about accessible publications, accessible content, what do we actually mean? And I'm going to turn to Martin for this one, if I may, Martin. So can you tell us, Martin, what do we mean by accessible publications, and perhaps some of the differences in say, EPUB versus PDF?
Accessible publications are basically ones that can be accessed by any reader. So no matter what your particular requirements are to accessing that content, an accessible publication allows you to engage with it. The format, certainly in the book world, that I think has become the primary accessible format is EPUB 3. But many publishers, either have legacy content in PDF or they produce primarily PDFs for layout and other reasons. So you have to address both formats. I think that if you're not producing one of those, if you haven't started producing EPUBs, for example, it is very important that you make a sort of strategic decision for your organisation which route you want to go down. In my book, accessibility is much more embedded in EPUB as a format because it's based on web technologies, which themselves are accessible. The content can reflow and adapt to the screen size, and you can embed alt text and long descriptions and also navigational support within the file. The other thing that EPUB does is it has a feature called media overlays, so it can synchronize text and voice, which you can't do in PDF. And in all round, it's much more text-to-speech friendly. So, Stacy was mentioning readers with a print disability do rely on assistive technologies to access that content, and so there is often an intermediary bit of software between them and the actual content they're accessing. EPUB makes that interaction a lot more straightforward because it was designed with structure and navigation in mind. Now, PDF. What about PDF? So one thing I would like to say is there's two flavors of PDF. There's a standard PDF, and then there's a format called PDF UA, which stands for Universally Accessible. And that is, the PDF UA is Adobe's attempt at pushing PDF into the accessible content space. And it's just been published in a new version earlier in the year. It is more accessible than a standard PDF, which can't reflow, can't do any of the navigational things that you can do in an EPUB. But it allows for a certain amount of structuring of the content, and is a sort of credible attempt at making PDFs more accessible. However, there is a big however, and that is that when you look at the vendors that a lot of us will be engaging with to get our content formatted, companies like Integra, their workflows for formatting the content that we submit, which still tends to be largely Word files, are geared around accessible EPUBs and not around PDF UAs. So I am not aware of a single vendor who has an accessible PDF UA workflow that generates that as an output. And that is a huge limitation. So there would be significantly additional costs involved in creating PDF UAs because the automation in the workflow just isn't there at the moment. And given that it's not naturally the most accessible format anyway, the question is whether the industry will rally around PDF UA as a genuinely accessible format, or whether EPUB has effectively won that race against PDF. That's, I think, how the landscape currently sits. So that's the context that we're all operating in. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you, Martin. Vanessa, Suresh, do you have anything to add?
No, I think, so as Martin has mentioned, so EPUB is one of the, favorable or recommended accessible output. And PDF, yes, you can bring in certain amount of accessibility into it, but there are a lot of best practices that you need to follow. There is a lot of human intervention is needed to bring to a stage where your PDF is accessible, which I'll talk about it in a little later.
Thank you, Suresh. Vanessa?
No,
Great,
fine.
thank you. I think, Suresh makes a great point there about, there are more steps you need to take in order to make a PDF fully accessible. And it's a very interesting question in general. So any of you that have sort of heard me talk about this, and I talk about it a lot, I always talk about how do you unscramble a scrambled egg? What you don't want to do when you're considering, well, what about cost? What about resources? We have a lot of, as we said, we have a lot of, information and knowledge gaps when it comes to the EAA. But the one thing that we do know is that it will take more resource and more money if you remediate later. So if you don't build it into accessibility into your workflow, it's going to cost a lot more in the long run. And I'm not saying that there's, and again, there's no one size fits all approach here. And I think that's really important. You need to, and as I think Martin touched on this, you need to decide on a process that works best for you. So we're going to talk about workflows now. So we're going to talk about, we're not talking about remediating old content yet, but we are going to touch on the backlist later, because the backlist is, of course, a very important one. But thinking about sort of new content and building accessibility into your workflow, as I've mentioned, it's so important to do that and to start thinking about doing that. Vanessa, could you tell us about, I know that Amsterdam Uni Press have recently sort of gone through that process of building it into the workflow. Could you tell us about that?
Yes. So I think what is interesting for Amsterdam University Press is that so we're a humanities and social sciences publisher. We're mid-sized. We published about 130 monographs a year in English. We have never produced EPUBs for our content. It has always been standard PDF based, because we serve the library market and we've never really considered the reflowable format. So this is a new journey for us, basically. And we don't have our own content platform either, so we depend on aggregators and vendors out there to help disseminate our content. So these two factors are very important for us. So when I started looking into the EEA 2 years ago, I couldn't really find a lot of, I started looking online, that didn't really help me, so I decided at the London Book Fair of last year that I would have to talk to people. And I started talking, I basically turned to the aggregators, because they are the ones that we work with very closely, and I figured they are the ones who need to help us set this up. And that was surprisingly unfruitful. So I just didn't get any answers from anybody, because it wasn't at that point a very important discussion point. And I guess the one that did sort of open my eyes was a conversation that I had at the end of the fair with Gobi, who specifically said to me, we've already started working on that, and we are envisioning certain standards or alarm bells, or they said it will have an effect on your sales. If you don't jump on that wagon, you will miss out on a possible participation in Gobi moving forward. So that scared the hell out of me. So I went back to Amsterdam University Press and said, we need to work on this. So the first step was to talk to our pre-press vendor. Now we have a very local setup with a trusted pre-press vendor that we've worked with for a long, long time. They're Belgium-based, and they had no idea. So we decided, and that's a very personal decision, and I think it's because of the legacy that we have in this relationship. We decided that we would educate each other. So we would serve as their guinea pigs and vice versa. So that's a slightly, perhaps I think in the long run, maybe a more difficult route that we've chosen, but we're also educating each other. So there's different things to say about that. So we've decided to start with 5 test files. We chose 5 different academic books. Now, we have a big part of our publishing program is in visual material cultures, history, media, film. So we do have quite a lot of books that contain images or more complicated content types. So we just picked a few that can represent different types of content, and we said, okay, start working on it. So they followed the guidelines that are out there. And in the Netherlands, which I think we're lucky that way, there's our Royal Library has started a partnership or a project together with an Italian-based foundation called the LIA Foundation. And this is all about accessibility and trying to help publishers remediating their backlist predominantly, but also they are willing to test files. So we agreed 5 test files. 1 goes to Gobi because they offered to test the files, and 1 goes via this project, the Royal Library and the LIA Foundation, to them to see what kind of results we get back. And based on those results, we changed some of the features of the EPUBs that we were testing. They've now been tested. And the next step was creating a workflow template. So just to get the workflow and the costs under control, we needed to make templates with them. Now, they do the work. I'm there for feedback, and honestly, I've been learning a lot through this whole process. But that's the stage where we are now at the moment. So we've got the test files, we have the templates, and we're now thinking, okay, so we want to start with the books that are in production and forthcoming. How quickly can we do the first ones and make it part of our offering, which is going to be, to start with, PDF, EPUB, and print simultaneously, because there's still so much unknown out there that we need to cover all our bases, we feel. So that's where we are at the moment.
Thank you, Vanessa. It's really interesting hearing about your experience. And I must ask, was it as painful as you thought it would be?
I think it is painful, absolutely. Yeah. I think the painfulness is being dependent on a third party. So there's the pre-pass, but they because they were new to the whole process, they had not created a team, accessibility team within the pre-press organization. So it's been a very slow process because of that, because they have to build in the time to actually do it, which is delaying a lot of this, a lot of the flow of this project. And on the other hand, I'm the only one at AUP who's able to sort of run this project, or who's made the time to do it. So the resources are really limited on both sides, which is, I think, the biggest frustration at the moment.
Yeah, I think there'll be many people can empathise with that, but it's great to hear, you know, how far you've been able to drive it forward, Vanessa. We're really grateful that you have. It's wonderful to hear that as well. Martin, can you share your experience from a Kogan page perspective?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, I work for a commercial publisher, and our constraints are slightly different from a university press. But we did start from the from the premise that we wanted to make our content available to every single reader who has an interest in it, and that's mainly, I think, to help our author expose their content to the widest possible audience. So even though you could say that's kind of a commercial decision, it is about inclusivity. It's about saying we want to exclude no readers from our content and on our author's behalf. So that was the motivation. But we came to it slightly differently. We realized at some point we would probably want to build a content platform on which our content can be consumed via subscriptions, for example, or via curated collections. And so we thought it would actually be helpful if on that platform the content looked fairly uniform and you didn't have every book looking completely different from the other. And we also didn't know, we might want to mix things up, create custom products, and that would be a lot easier if they already looked very similar. So that led us to think we want to have our own CSS, which determines the look and feel of EPUBs ultimately, and all content online. And then we thought, well, that's kind of starting the wrong way around. We know we want it to look uniform, but how do we get it to that point? And then we thought, actually, it means really we need to build a workflow that all our content is pushed through. At the end of that workflow, it's married up with the CSS and it becomes an EPUB. But we didn't want to have two workflows. We just wanted to have one born accessible workflow, because that is really hard to manage. I mean, I'm listening to some of the crossover sessions where the academic publishers were talking about being trade publishers as well. Then you have to do different things for different titles. That's a real challenge. And so from a production point of view, we want one workflow that generates, actually exactly like you say, a print PDF, an ePDF, and an EPUB file. But at that point we decided that EPUB file needs to fulfill, if we're going to go to that level of effort, it needs to fulfill the highest level of accessibility accreditation that's available in the market. Otherwise, why do we want to put the effort into building our own workflow? And the one thing that is different, instead of going to, say, the library and the Fundación Elia, we looked at the standards, because it's the standards that are in the market, like EPUB Accessibility 1.0, WCAG 2.2, and those standards are public property. They're not commercially owned by anybody. They're the W3C publishes them in language that even lay people can understand. You can read these standards, and even if you're not a specialist, they make you can get a lot of information from reading the standards. It's not that scary as you might think, and the fact that they're standards means you can then validate the output that follows those standards against those standards, and that validation happens. There's one accreditation process called Globally Certified Accessible (GCA) by an American organization called Benetech. And that is, to my knowledge, the only global accreditation program for accessible ebooks, and it is also all geared around EPUB. So that's another reason why EPUB is so important. That there is no globally accessible certification program for PDFs, and so we thought, well, if we can get GCA accredited, then that demonstrates that our files follow those open standards. And that they are as accessible as they possibly could be, because you have, an organization whose mission is to generate accessible content, telling you your books are accessible. And the aggregators you're talking about, companies like ProQuest and EBSCO, they obviously know Benetech very well. They're being pushed into that space, but by organizations like Benetech, and it just seemed to us that if we basically follow a standards-driven approach, that our content is compatible with all the open standards, then that's probably, in the long run, the best way to ensure that they will remain accessible. And then we're engaging with the standards, we're engaging with the certification, and our content is then ultimately the beneficiary of that. So we took a slightly different approach to this. However, even though we decided to build our own XHTML schema, and ignore the technical language for a moment, it's just we built a workflow that generates accessible EPUBs. vendors like Integra have already built those workflows. They already have that technology in place. And we work with Integra. They produce books to our schema, but our schema is kind of a flavor of their schema, if you like. They are ultimately compatible because we all follow exactly the same open standards, right? So there's nothing proprietary in any of this. And that is the other route we could have taken. We could have just gone, Suresh, we want to create accessible ebooks. We're already working with you. Tell us how to do it, right? And he would have been very happy to do so. It's just that at the stage when we did this, we wanted to have more control over our content because of the potential of building a content platform. We felt we needed to get under the hood of that content a bit more and not only rely on third-party expertise. And this is why I thought your point that you're educating each other with your vendor, I think that's actually a really important point. Everybody needs to feel they're going down a road that they can absorb and deal with in a way that isn't over their heads, and where they are ultimately learning. And actually learning with another organization means they will ask some questions that you won't be asking, and vice versa. You both get to the end goal together, and I think that's actually quite a good approach. In our case, we would have probably done that journey with someone like Integra if we'd gone down the same road, and there's several other companies out there that do something very similar to Integra. So there's no, in the English-speaking publishing scene anyway, there's no shortage of vendors. But the expertise is there. You do not have to start from zero. But it is very important to sort of clarify what your goal is. If your goal is to create content that is compliant with the open accessibility standards and generates a file that can be certified and validated as being accessible, then that gives you, I think, basically two options. You deal with a vendor who is themselves certified already, or you build your own sort of tool set. And that's a decision, that depends on how large is your organization, what kind of expertise have you, what is your budget, what kind of content have you got. As Stacy said earlier, that these are all very important considerations, but it's one of those two roads you have to go down. There's no third way, effectively. Sorry that I've been talking for so long.
No, that was really great. That's great to hear a different journey, different perspective. And you mentioned obviously working with vendors like Integra, and as we have Suresh with us. Suresh, I mean, will you tell us, how you work with publishers, sort of best practice for born accessible workflows, but also maybe a bit about, how you do that, working with InDesign. Can you speak to that a bit, please?
Sure, Tess. I think one of the advantages that you would have when you talk to your pre-press vendor is that they would have already worked with multiple publishers from big to small, right? They understand all the standards, and you can get into a consultant approach in understanding, okay, this is my content and this is where we are in the journey and how do we go about it, right? So one publisher will come up with, probably they'll have their own technical team, accessibility team, to kind of have the knowledge, but some of the publishers, smaller ones, they might need some knowledge on that. So that's where we come in and we kind of explain them, this is where you need to do. I think the born accessible is really important, especially going forward. So when you deal with content, right from the content creation, so you need to think of accessibility, whether it is content or any assets that you create, think from that angle. There are publishers, they do outsource their pre-press or the production activities to vendors like us, and there are publishers who do in-house. But there are some best practices that you could follow, like start creating the layouts in the form of accessibility. One is, of course, as Martin mentioned, so you can bring in the XHTML kind of workflow as part of your production process to deliver both print, digital, and ePDF. But when you are trying to do that with your InDesign, when you're creating these styles or when you're creating the templates, you have to consider certain aspect of it. I'm not going into technical, but certain things, for example, the paragraph styles, character styles that you use, it has to be consistent and has to follow some hierarchy. And similarly, try and have an option to include alt text, and try and have, for example, the tables, try and say that these are the heading and these are the rest of the table, right? So when you create a PDF out of your InDesign document, so when you export the document with an accessible requirement, your PDF would be already tagged with the accessibility requirement in terms of reading order and stuff like that. So your prepress vendor might already have tools and workflows that are already set up to kind of do this. So when you work with them, so right from the beginning, you can set up a workflow in a way that your templates, layouts are set in a way that you can export the accessible output from your print products, right? So these are some of the best practices, and you need to talk to your prepress vendors to kind of take help from them, get knowledge out of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suresh, and thank you to Vanessa and Martin. I think it's really interesting to get the three different journeys to accessible content, because going back to what we said, there is no one-size-fits-all approach, and so to hear the variety in those approaches is really, really helpful. So we've talked about building accessibility into your workflow, so we're going to move on to another hot topic of accessibility that I'm sure you're all familiar with, and that is image descriptions. And so for those of you who aren't so familiar with image descriptions, it kind of is what it says on the tin, really. It's describing your images for people who have difficulty in seeing or interpreting them. So there's various different types of image description, but two just to touch upon. So we have alt text, and that's typically a description that's attached to something that needs it, that is heard by somebody using text-to-speech. So it can't be seen on screen, if you like. It's not there for other people to see it. It's in the underlying code, so it's heard by people using text-to-speech, but you can't see it on the page. And it's typically usually, it's for shorter descriptions of, very basic sort of level descriptions of pictures or even logos. When you get into STEM content, so science, it used to be science, technology, engineering, and math, and now I'm delighted to say it stands for science, technology, engineering, math, and medicine, because there are actually visually impaired and blind people studying medicine. I don't know if that scares anyone. I think it's brilliant. And so it now includes medicine, and that comes up a lot in these discussions about describing images around medicine. But when you come to that sort of content, I'm sure you all appreciate that needs a lot more than just 10, 20, 30 words of description. You could have a very complex mathematical equation to deal with. You could have a graph, a diagram. If your doctor is visually impaired, you want to make sure they've had really good long descriptions when they've been studying in medicine, right? And so it's really important to get that stuff right. And so we're going to talk a bit about what do we mean by image descriptions, but more importantly, what are the challenges, and how do we make sure that we're getting that right? And the key thing to mention as well with long descriptions, different to alt text, long descriptions can be seen on the page because it's not possible to, if you put them in the background so that they can't be seen but they can be heard, to reverse that famous proverb, you're not able to interact with it if you're a text-to-speech user. You can't interrogate it, you can't read it word by word or line by line, which is fine if the image just says picture of a beautiful golden Labrador lying on a stage. That's fine. But if it's a very complex description of, say, the human brain, you don't want to rely on somebody hearing that once and going, okay, I must understand what that means, or having to listen to it again. But it could be 100 or 200 words long. So if you can imagine you've read a page and someone says, oh, but I'm only going to show you a snapshot of a page, and it's gone. Snapshot of a page, and it's gone. It's not going to work for you. It's not going to work for them when it comes to long description, and that's why you can see it on the page. Now, where you put that, again, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It depends on what you want your output to look like. So many publishers, including TNF, will put ours in an appendix, but it will make sure that you can easily link and most importantly, backlink to that description, to that image. And it's really important to make sure that you have that element in there so that people aren't having to go to different locations and finding it difficult to get back to where they need to be. But again, it's all about sort of personal preference. So I'm gonna pick on you again, Vanessa, at the beginning, if I may. Can you talk to us about sort of some of the challenges or opportunities that you've had in incorporating alt text into your material? I presume it's more alt text than long description for your content.
Yes, so fortunately we don't have to deal with autonomy lessons in our image, in the content that we publish. So I think most of the images that are in our books are film, visual and material, history related. And we thought about, trying to understand, first of all, I had to understand, okay, so there's an actual difference between the captions, the source text, and then there's the alt text. So there's different types of descriptions, which you can look up. It's very well described everywhere what the purpose is of this. And we decided that we at least wanted to try with our in-production titles and forthcoming titles that we want to incorporate that text into the author instructions. We want to really for the authors to help us in this. I think for our content, there's a very fine line between the source text, the relation to the images, and although you can, of course, and that will come up after my little talk, AI generated descriptions, we're looking at accessibility as something that is part of the entire process. So it's important, I think, that we educate our authors to incorporate that in their writing flow. And as much as they are now used to producing captions, they're used to producing lots of different aspects of their research for a book production. So this is just something that's going to be added on, and I think that it will help us to have that at a very early stage and to be able to take it with us in the entire workflow so that we don't have to add it on in a later stage. So we give our authors author guidelines, style guides, and this will simply be part of that. So it will be an instruction that they are given, and it will go through the process of our manuscript checks, our technical checks, and our typesetting. Everything will be sort of part of that. Now, there's a couple of guidelines that we've already sort of looked at, and we're going to refine that. We haven't yet produced a document, but we will soon. That's how we're perceiving it.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Vanessa. And I think it's really interesting to hear you say about doing it at the same time as building it into your workflow. Yeah. And so when you're creating accessible EPUBs, making sure that the alt text is part of that process rather than coming later. And because I think, presumably you've found that that's a much more sort of resource efficient and cost efficient way of doing things.
Because that's another, I think, aspect of this is that as a mid-sized university press, we don't have the staffing to, which would be, for example, AI-generated descriptions. They would need to be checked by people, edited. You need human eyes to go over them. That's a whole different, I think, also a staffing issue and a human resources issue. I think that's part of the choice of wanting to also make the authors more responsible of their content, and this is going to be part of their content.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Again, I'm a creature of habit, so I'm going to go Vanessa to Martin again. Martin, can you talk a little bit about how Kogan Page have gone about embedding image descriptions in the workflow?
Yeah, so not in that way. So basically, we have enough problems getting manuscripts out of our authors. We do not want to burden them with additional work, even though you could argue it fits into their workflow. I think because we're a commercial publisher, our authors are not academics. They tend to be consultants or run their own businesses, that kind of thing. They have no time. So and plus, I should say, we're not a STEM publisher, so most of our graphics are sort of vector graphics of one sort or another, bar charts, pie charts, things like that, workflow diagrams. And they therefore don't really require, I would say, a high level of subject matter expertise. A normal reader should be able to make sense of those diagrams. If they can't, then they probably shouldn't be in the book in the first place. So it's a particular context in which we operate, and our images are, in fact, I would say, they can very successfully be described by AI-supported tools, and so there are specialist vendors out there, alt text vendors, that already use AI to generate alt text and long descriptions. And one benefit, from our point of view, a benefit is that if an AI creates the first draft, and you're quite right, you have to have a human eye on that alt text description. You don't want to have sort of hallucinated alt text in a book. But you can set it word limits, so you can say create an alt text that's no longer than X words and a long description that's no longer than Y number of words. That's also one way in which we control the cost. So we say it's this much per alt text, this much per long description, and they all have the same number of words. And the AI will generate literally to that prompt. And then a human at the alt text vendor will read the alt text, make sure it makes sense in terms of the graphic. But that whole process is still a lot more effective than them writing from scratch. And the other big benefit is, stylistically, all the alt text and long descriptions are then effectively uniform across our books, because they're all generated by AI and not by 100 different authors who might all have slightly different linguistic preferences, and so they become more predictable. And the one thing that we did do in order to sort of test that as a workflow was we looked at graphics from about 50 of our books, pulled out lots of different graphics that roughly represent the breadth of our visual content, and we generated our own alt text and sort of had a go at literally describing them to see how difficult is it to come up with image descriptions, because if you put, say, a 200-word limit on a description, you actually have to think quite carefully about how to describe an image. It's not self-evident which bits you focus on and which bits you leave out. But there is a sort of knack to it, I would say, and to create good alt text and long descriptions, I think, is a separate skill set from writing a book, and authors don't necessarily have it. So we did our own sort of alt text and long descriptions. Said we'd be happy with these. We ran them past our authors. They said yes, we would find them acceptable. Then we gave those graphics to the alt text vendor and said, right, now you generate them to this brief, and then we compared what we got back with our own initial attempt, and we were surprised, actually, how close they matched. So we thought, well, that means whatever decisions the AI is making is pretty good for our type of visual content, right? So I'm literally excluding STEM from this. But it works for us, and the benefit is these can be turned around very quickly because it's AI generated. They don't take weeks to produce. So we actually give the alt text vendor a set of proofs. They run the AI tools over it, check the alt text, and then send back a spreadsheet with each alt text and long descriptions, one in each column, linked to the figure number or the table that they're describing, and that goes to the vendor, in this case Integra, and they have then got tools that can import those directly from the CSV file into InDesign. And then when they're in there, we check them basically, because the vendors already checked them, we spot check them at reviser stage. So the production editor will go through and spot check the alt text. And if they find a single one that they think looks iffy, then we look at them all. So it is selective, but and so we're not losing any time basically, because they're being produced in parallel to while the book is being proofread by the author and the proofreader, the alt text is generated. So it's not adding additional time to the production schedule. And it works for us, is all I can say, although I can totally understand. But we pay for that. We pay for the alt text and long description, so that's the downside, right? It's not free, which you could argue authors might give you that for free. But I think in a commercial setting, I don't think we would be able to persuade every author to do alt text. And then that means you then have to have two workflows. One is where you get the author alt text, and one is where you don't. And we just said, no, we can only have one workflow. There's, and it's AI-supported alt text generation. And they are quite cheap because it's AI. So, and if you do a deal with a vendor, then it doesn't actually add that much to the cost. Partly depends on how many graphics you have, so that's the other thing. But typically we have, I don't know, between 20 and 50 figures in a book, that kind of level, sometimes more. But that's very, very affordable. I mean, basically nobody's really noticed the cost of those. So it's all about the efficiency rather than thinking only about the cost. And the quality is important, but I think if you deal with a vendor whose main purpose is to generate alt text and long descriptions, they get very good at it, and they deal with huge range of content, visual content. So, and that was our approach. But everybody has their own constraints. So this isn't about is there one preferable to the other. It's just alternative routes that you can take.
Thank you, Martin. That's really helpful. And I think it's really interesting, and I'm going to come to Suresh in a second, but I think the concept of cost is a really interesting one, and resourcing something. And I think sometimes we make I'm going to call it the mistake of taking accessibility and putting it in a silo and going, but it's going to cost more to make that content accessible. But actually everything you do costs something, as a publisher. And so it's about also pushing that message through your organization of realizing that actually it's just another cost to bear that you would have to bear alongside all the other costs that you have when publishing content. And so having those conversations across your organization, whether you're 10 people or 1,000 or 10,000 people, making sure that you have those conversations and that kind of context is understood, and that accessibility is not this massive independent bear that's coming after you. It's actually something that should have been happening all along, making your content accessible to everyone. It's just that we're now being sort of pushed into looking at it more kind of strongly by the EAA coming round. I'm sure we would have all gotten there eventually, but it's sometimes it's nice just to have a bit of a poke in the back, isn't it? So, Suresh, could you talk a little bit about, I guess your view or Integra's view on who's the best person to, create image descriptions, particularly when you're talking about, HSS versus STEM, and the best time to create it in the workflow as well?
Yeah. See, I think as Vanessa mentioned, author would be the ideal person to kind of give the alt text, but then like commercial publisher, you can't expect that, they are not from that domain or this one. So there are tools out there, and if you look at many vendors who have set up their AI center of excellence, one of the use case definitely would be like alt text creation. If you have to deal with a lot of legacy content, there has to be a system which can give you a scale, like where alt text can be created and somebody can review at it. And now the AI has got a lot of maturity in terms of it can give you a content which is varied complexity of images. I've seen AI can provide, for example, the medical images. It can give you description by taking the context around the image, and it can give you some initial version of alt text. And then you can put this across to author during the proofing stage or editor during the proofing stage, where they can validate it and then they can approve it. So this is how you could bring in an alt text in a workflow, and one author would be the one who can create it, or they can use some of the tools there, or subject matter expert who understands this better and who understand the accessibility requirement, who can use these tools to create an alt text.
Thank you, Suresh. I'm going to pick up on one thing that you said, though, and I'm going to disagree. It's terrible, isn't it, as the chair? So you said initially that perhaps the author is the best person to write alt text. I'm not so sure about that. I think that I think in some cases, perhaps. I think certainly when you're looking at STEM content, the author is the best person to review the alt text and to say whether or not it's an accurate depiction or description of what they're conveying with that image. But actually, you know, we've seen a variety of different options. We've kind of tried them all out at TNF, and some of our authors are fantastic at providing alt text, and they do it really well. And some of them, it's not their forte. Writing alt text is a skill in itself, and actually sometimes the author, their skill is producing that textbook. They know absolutely everything there is to know about their own subject, but when it comes to writing alt text and putting something visual into a written language, it is a skill set. And so I wouldn't always say leaning on, you know, using the authors is the best approach or the ideal approach. But I think, you know, where you can involve them, and if that's possible in your workflow, then yeah, absolutely. You know, why not? I mean, the more people involved in making things accessible, the better, absolutely.
I mean, something you can all try, if you have a GPT-4 account that allows you to upload files, just upload a few JPEGs and ask for an alt text description and put a word limit against it. It's actually really useful to try that and see what you get out. You'll very quickly notice either it's getting it right, or your graphics are somehow unusual. And there wouldn't be any context around that because you'd just be uploading the JPEG. But for a lot of graphics, you know, the context isn't taken into account by the alt text AI anyway. It's only for very specialized use cases where that's the case. But I think it's a useful way to test, you know, to test what's there, and then you because I think engaging with these things is not difficult. Literally, upload a JPEG, ask a question, you get an answer, and it's that simple. So I would encourage everybody to have a go.
I would agree, and it's lots of fun as well. It's great fun when you're running an image through and you want to see what kind of description you get. Put a picture of your family, ask what age they look. You know, it's great, and it'll tell you, and it's you can have fun with it.
And
you
watch
know?
the house melt down when they.
Yeah, exactly. You know, you can bring that to a dinner party. You'll go down a storm. You can have a lot of fun with it. So, I think there's a lot of. I think the key thing there is around context as well, because and Suresh mentioned about the Integra being able to actually pick up the context around an image if you're using AI is so important, because what you don't want is something that's sort of free floating and it doesn't really make sense in the context that it's in, or it's simply a repetition of what's already been said in the book. Those aren't helpful descriptions, and so bringing all of that together. And making sure that it fits within the context, I think, and not just a repetition.
There's one little thing. You may have heard of the concept of an image being decorative, and then it doesn't need an alt text, right, or a long description. But who makes the decision whether the image is decorative or not, right? Okay. That's where I think the alt text vendor, the human part of the alt text vendor, comes in, right? They can look at the context and they can say, actually, this doesn't need an image description. And you only get invoiced for the ones that have image descriptions against them. But I think a human ultimately probably needs to make that call, at the moment at least. And that's why I think that's another reason, if you ask the author, will there be best place to say this is decorative or it's not decorative? I think it's better, from my point of view, it's good if you're dealing with somebody who's got rules around that decision making, and they apply them to all their customers, and then they're likely to be robust rules.
Great. Suresh, do you have anything to add to that? Because I realise we've just taken loads of your points and then sort of discussed them and thrown them in the air.
No, I think, as Martin mentioned, especially with the decorative images, like vendors can they have some tools, automated tools, to tag which is decorative and non-decorative images. So the AI can create only alt text for the ones that are not decoratives. And you can bring that into your workflow. And, I think once the alt text is created as part of the workflow, so it could be during the proofing, author review, they can validate. There are tools that are there where author review the proofs. You can enable them to review it during that time. Yeah.
Thank you, Suresh. So we're going to move on from image descriptions.
4 more minutes.
Yeah.
4 minutes?
4 more minutes.
Yeah, perfect, thank you. So we're just going to touch on the backlist, because of course that's a very important part of it all. So looking at how best to handle the backlist. And so one thing I would say is, don't let legacy content hinder your progress. You don't have to boil the ocean, but you have to make a start, and you have to make sure that you are talking about it at a strategy level. The EAA, we talk about disproportionate burden. There is not a number on that. It's not, well, unless you've got fewer than 10 staff in your organisation, but it's not like, oh, you've got X number of books in your backlist, therefore you have 5 years to make it accessible. That 5 years does apply if you have a significant backlist and you can evidence that you are working on it, but that it will take you some time. And so I want to make sure that we do cover the backlist. And so, Suresh, I'm going to come back to you, if you don't mind. Could you talk about how Integra would handle managing backlist content and legacy content?
Yeah, so one thing, during our consultant process, so we understand the number of titles that are there in the backlist and what level of accessibility that has undergone in the backlist. So we audit the titles, and then we come up with a report in terms of the remediation that is required to meet the accessibility requirement. And then depending upon the type of file, let's say if they have a PDF, if they have an application file, or if they have an EPUB with the older versions which is not accessible compliant. So we'll come up with a report in terms of the remediation that you need to do and how long that it can be done. And also we will give you approximate cost in terms of for budgeting. That's another important factor. So you can look at the cost, and then you can decide on the timeline, and then you can go ahead and convert all your backlist into an accessible content.
I think what is also maybe interesting to mention is that for the backlist, you don't have to do everything in one go. You can make selections first, and that can be based on maybe perhaps usage figures that you have of your ebooks, or it can be maybe you would like to prefer open access the way that Charles mentioned, I think, in his talk as well. Open access is very much linked to accessibility, so you might just want to start with your open access ebooks, or you might want to go with maybe the most important disciplines that you publish in, or there's all sorts of way of approach, and you can do it in different phases, so you don't need to look at that. When you look at that backlist, it's daunting for most of us. Even for mid-size, it's daunting, but you can take it step by step, and you can make preferred selection processes for that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other key thing I would say is make sure you have an accessibility contact person in your organisation, so that if your content's not accessible, whether it's for the front list or the back list, make sure that there is somebody they can contact, and it's in your accessibility statement, and it's clear, this is who you contact, and this is our SLE, this is how long it will take us to get an accessible version back to you, and that you have that in your process as well, because that will take you a long way. It shows you've thought about it, it shows you're considering how to support those who can't directly access that content at the moment. We are coming up to time, which is amazing, because I'm sure the panel was slightly nervous we wouldn't have enough to talk about. We need an entire day. So I'm wondering, can we spare 2 minutes to see if there are any questions from the audience? Brilliant.
It might be a bit of a stupid question, but what actually happens on June the 28th? Like, if you haven't done it,
A gun appears and is held very close to your
I feel like
head.
there's going to be a massive explosion and the bear's going to shred us.
I love that question. That's brilliant.
Okay, so I've just had one of those guns appearing, where I thought, oops. So I had recently, and I asked him if I could share this. So I can share it. It's not definitive. So I talked to John Elwell from Gobi, and he said, yes, you can, share this, but please, it's not definitive. So Gobi is now thinking of a strategy for that June 24th month, where they are going to, he said, we will decide that month that we are not going to deliver any PDFs to Europe anymore. And that's a pretty big thing for us. We're like, oh, okay. So this is one of those guns that might appear on June 24, is that suddenly part of your content might not be disseminated in Europe anymore.
I would say that's also, if you are considering converting your backlist, you theoretically have the choice between PDF UA or EPUB. And this kind of statement then, skews it heavily in favor of EPUB, right? So I think that is key, because you have to, if your vendor converts your backlist or makes it accessible, you still have to agree with them what is the final output, what format are you converting to, and I think that's the fundamental decision you've got to make. And if it's EPUB, then they can take the PDF, they can convert it into EPUB, put in alt text and long descriptions. That's all possible. But then that's the decision. You get EPUBs back rather than PDFs. Right? And that's why this is a strategic sort of level decision. For the academic publishers who are publishing trade content, for example, you can't upload PDFs to the Kindle store. It has to be EPUB, right? So you can't, in my view, the PDF is for that reason alone is ruled out. But I'm not saying it's an inaccessible format. I'm just saying that the supply chain at the moment doesn't support PDF UA as an accessible format in the way that it does support EPUB. And the aggregators are waking up to that. And the rest of the supply chain, Apple, Amazon, Kobo, they all have EPUB readers. So if you are in B2C at all, then that is also a consideration. But it just covers both. So again, for me, it's a no-brainer to go for EPUB because you can cover all your B2C store requirements as well as your accessibility requirements for academic institutions.
Well, Martin, get off the fence. What do you prefer, EPUB or PDF?
EPUB. A GCA-accredited EPUB 3, to be precise.
Thank you so much, Martin, Vanessa, Suresh. We're probably going to have to wrap it up there. There is so much to discuss, but please find us afterwards. Talk amongst yourselves. Join digital accessible communities, the Publishing Accessibility Action Group. These conversations will keep happening. They're happening more and more. Please find us afterwards, and thank you so much for joining, especially over the lunch hour. Please go and enjoy your lunch and talk about the EAA. Thank you.